It's a pleasure to have you here tonight. This is the last of 7 lectures this semester in our Leadership Lecture Series. And why do we call this a leadership series? Because we seek to feature the people who make a huge impact on our world, whose ideas and actions make our lives better. And don't we have an amazing person tonight who's done that for so many people? So it's thrilling to have you join us this evening. Without the support of Book Passage, this is a crucial partnership we have together. And Elaine Petruccelli is here tonight. She will be up at the podium a little later on tonight. You'll get to meet her then. But Elaine and Bill Petruccelli have been crucially important to our partnership because with their support, they help to bring these great people to our town and then help us to hear their good ideas. So may we thank Book Passage and do that every day when you buy your books. With such a large program this semester, we have a remarkable sponsor to support us, and he's in the room tonight, Mr. Richard Stone, the CEO of Private Ocean Wealth Management, the oldest and largest wealth management in Marin County, and we thank you so much for your support. Thank you for your help. And all of the people that you see helping tonight, these are all volunteers, our students and staff who join us tonight to welcome you to our campus. I hope you feel welcomed by them, and thank you. Thank us to help me thank them for their help. To introduce our speaker tonight is a remarkable person, a really important Marin leader. Her name is Ms. Pat Kendall. She is a medical group administrator at Kaiser Permanente, and she has several leadership roles at Kaiser, both strategic, financial, quality, care, service, people. She's community focused. And she has several degrees, which is fitting to be here at our university, one in nursing, business, organizational development, HR, and leadership. So it's appropriate that she is here with us. She's a busy woman, wasn't she? She's completed her post-grad work at Berkeley and Stanford, so it's really terrific to have her. She sits on many boards, the North Bay Leadership Council, Healthy Marin Partnership, Lifehouse, School to Career Partnership, Marin Economic Forum, Hospice, and Marin Sustainable Agriculture, and most importantly, she's on Dominican University of California's advisory board for the School of Health and Natural Sciences. So please welcome Ms. Pat Kendall.
Excited, everybody? Huh? Okay, I'll get off really quick to get the main event. But anyway, I wanted to say it's a privilege to be with you tonight and to be able to hear this wonderful lecture. And I also have the great honor to say on behalf of Dominican Leadership Lecture Series and Book Passages, good evening and welcome. This evening, Dr. Weil, who has devoted the past 30 years to developing, applying, and teaching others about the principles of integrative medicine, he will talk to us about his book, which has a great title, Spontaneous Happiness. Dr. Weil is a best-selling author and an internationally recognized expert on integrative medicine, medicinal plants, and mind-body interactions. He was named one of the 100 most influential people in the world in 2005 and one of the top 25 visionaries in 2007 by Time magazine. Let's give a clap for that. He's a gentleman who's Harvard through and through. He received his medical degree and his undergraduate degree in biology and botany from Harvard University. In 1994, he established the Arizona Center for Integrative Medicine at the University of Arizona, where he's also a clinical professor of medicine, professor of public health, and the Lovell Jones Professor of Integrated Rheumatology. And I can tell you from my medical background, that is pretty amazing. The center trains physicians, medical students, nurse practitioners, pharmacists, and allied health professionals in the philosophy and the practice of integrative medicine. And I think the key word there is philosophy. Dr. Weil is also the founder of the Weil Foundation, an organization dedicated to sustaining the vision of integrative medicine. He is also the editorial director of drweil.com, the leading online resource for healthy living based on the philosophy of integrative medicine. I think that's pretty special as well. In Spontaneous Happiness, Dr. Weil gives us the foundation for attaining and sustaining optimum emotional health. Rooted in Dr. Weil's pioneering work in integrative medicine, the book suggests a reinterpretation of the notion of happiness. Give that a thought for a second. The reinterpretation of the notion of happiness discusses the limitations of the biomedical model in treating depression and elaborates on the inseparability of both body and mind. I really feel we're in for a treat tonight, so ladies and gentlemen, please give a spontaneous and warm welcome to Dr. Andrew Weil.
Okay, great. Thanks. Thank you. Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm going to talk to you about happiness and depression, subjects which have been much on my mind. I found out about 2 years ago that the most frequent question coming to my website, drweil.com, was about depression. That surprised me. And then I began looking into some of the statistics, some of which I think you've probably heard, that now 1 in 10, it's probably now 1 in 9 Americans is on prescribed antidepressant medication. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal 2 days ago that said 1 in 5 of us are now on prescribed psychiatric drugs in general. You know, what does this mean? You know, why is this happening? And this includes millions of children. I also was personally interested in this because in my 20s, 30s, and 40s, particularly, I suffered from depression. I had what would probably be diagnosed as dysthymic disorder today, the technical term for mild to moderate depression. I once tried an antidepressant medication. I took it for 5 days and stopped because I couldn't stand the way it made me feel, both in my body and mind. I tried various strategies for dealing with that, and I really don't have it anymore. And I don't know whether not having it is a result of growing older. I think more likely it's the result of cumulative changes that I made in my lifestyle, and I wanted to put a lot of that information into the book because I think it's very useful. So I want you to think about, you know, why are we in the midst of an epidemic of depression in our culture? You know, why has this reached this proportion today? I hear many people say that everyone they know is depressed. A lot of people seem to blame this on the state of the world or the economy. But my parents lived through the Great Depression, which makes what's happening now look pretty tame. And they also lived through World War II, which is probably the most horrific human experience in history. And all indications are that mental and emotional health were much better in our population in that period than they are now. So I don't think it has anything to do with the world. I think the world has always been this way. I think the world is always teetering on the edge of catastrophe, and somehow we make it through, or at least we have so far. So I think there's something else going on here. Now, clearly it seems to me that some of the depression epidemic is manufactured by the medical pharmaceutical complex, which has been very successful at convincing people that ordinary states of sadness are matters of unbalanced brain biochemistry which require treatment with drugs. By the way, while I'm on that, let me get on a little political soapbox here. I would urge all of you to get out there and work to end immediately the practice of direct advertising to consumers of prescription drugs. Only one other country in the world allows that, New Zealand. I have no idea how that happened here, how that got slipped through. It has been a disaster for the practice of medicine, an absolute boon for the pharmaceutical companies. It should be ended immediately. And we can end it if enough of us get together and write our legislators, we can stop it. And you know, consumers have terrific power today. And with the advent of social media, you know, there is great potential to change things. I mean, look what happened to Netflix. Look what happened to the Bank of America recently. Well, let's make the same thing happen to the pharmaceutical companies and end the practice of direct-to-consumer advertising. And in one of the areas in which this has been most disastrous is the advertising of antidepressant medications. I don't know what the percentage of the depression epidemic is that is manufactured in this way. Maybe it's a quarter, maybe it's a third. But let's say we take that out. We're still left with a lot of depression to explain. So, what's happened? One clue that I came across in doing research for spontaneous happiness is that depression is virtually unknown in the hunter-gatherer societies that are left on the planet. You cannot find a case of major depression in Papua New Guinea. Depression seems to be a feature of modern life, and it correlates strongly with affluence. This is happening in all developed countries, and the more affluent the countries, the greater the rates of discontent and depression. So that's interesting. What's different about hunter-gatherer societies and us? Well, everything. Those people are living connected to nature in a way that we're not. They're eating diets that are natural, that are not industrialized food-like stuff that now constitutes most of the mainstream American diet. They're getting regular physical activity. I think a very important difference is that they enjoy tremendous protection from tribe and community. There's a great deal of medical evidence that social connectedness strongly protects against depression. And I think that one of the most striking sociological changes that's happened in America over the past 100 years is increasing social isolation. I think this is, again, something happening in all developing countries, but especially strong here. Many things account for that. I think today, the advent of new media and virtual reality strongly has accelerated that process of social isolation and disconnection. But, it's interesting to look back and see how changes in our ways of living have fostered this. And I'll give you one example that I used in the book. I grew up in a row house in Philadelphia in the late 1940s, 1950s. One of my memories, very vivid, is that in the era before air conditioners, on hot summer nights, the entire block was sitting out on front steps. Kids were playing ball in the streets. And this was a tremendous opportunity for neighborhood interaction. I mean, there was a real community out on the front steps in those evenings. When we got an air conditioner, it became possible to stay indoors. And we congratulated ourselves on that. This was a sign of progress and that we had made it to a certain level. I think that's representative of the way a lot of the conveniences and technological advancement of modern living have undermined social connection. It's made it easier and easier for us to live in isolated cocoons that are very comfortable, and we think this is a good thing. A tremendous number of people I meet today say they don't even know their neighbors. I mean, this is not uncommon in America today. So I think this is a very significant factor, that increasing social isolation, I think, is one of the main factors responsible for epidemic depression that we're seeing today. I made reference to effects of information overload and new media and internet and so forth. I think this is another tremendous factor. I think all of this is changing human brain function in ways that we don't yet understand. It's possible that in some ways these changes are improvements. Clearly kids growing up today have better hand-eye coordination as a result of playing video games than I do. And maybe they're better at multitasking, but that's, I think, questionable, because the research also is very clear that the human brain really cannot do more than one thing at once. All it can do is rapidly switch back and forth. You can get very good at that kind of switching, and kids raised on computers may be good at that kind of switching, but the clear evidence is that performance suffers when you do that. Moreover, one of the messages that's so strong from Eastern psychology is that practice at maintaining attention in the present moment is one secret of positive emotional states, and that anything that fragments attention takes us away from that present reality, from being mindful, and undermines emotional wellness. And I think that all of the stuff that we're subject to today encourages that kind of fragmentation. I find in my own life, one of the changes that I observe since email and texting and cell phones is that my sense of time is very speeded up, and it seems like I never have enough time to catch up. Before all of this, I had lots of time to read in the afternoons and evenings. I hardly ever have time to read anymore. It's commonly said that as you grow older, your sense of subjective time speeds up. One explanation that's proposed is that each moment of time is a smaller fraction of the total time that you've lived. But I was very surprised some years ago to hear my daughter, who was then 12, I think, say that she had the same experience. My sense now is that Christmas comes around like this. It's and she said she had the same experience. I didn't have that experience when I was her age. Time moved really slowly. Summer vacations went really slow. She and her friends don't have that experience today. And I think it's that more is happening per unit of time. We are subject to an unprecedented amount of stimulation and information. And I think this has all sorts of consequences, one of which is this sense that you're always falling behind and you never have time to catch up. I don't know what the solution to this is. I'll tell you what I do, is I make rules for myself to limit usage. So at say 2 in the afternoon or 3 in the afternoon, I try to disengage completely from my computer, from cell phones, and I don't pay attention again to the next morning. I don't always succeed at that, but that's what I try to do. I have a particularly hard time with email, which has become my main means of communicating, and I can get completely overwhelmed with that. And I'll tell you something interesting that I also thought of when I was writing this book. I started out as a psychology major at Harvard before I shifted into botany. I shifted into botany out of frustration with psychology in those days, which was dominated by behaviorism. And the leading apostle of behaviorism was B.F. Skinner, who was a professor at Harvard, and I became his student. He was my advisor. I was very much enthralled by his style of lecturing. He was very clever and articulate. Behaviorism attempts, I was interested in consciousness. I wanted to understand what consciousness was and how it affects how we perceive and experience the world. Behaviorism denied consciousness. It tried to explain behavior without any reference to consciousness, which was felt to be unstudyable, and instead to relate behavior to environmental influences. And the main way of getting at this was to study rats and pigeons in caged circumstances and how they would respond to getting rewards of food pellets in response to pressing a bar. So one of the things that Skinner is the one who invented the terms positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement. And one of the things that he showed very clearly is that how an animal behaves in order to get food is determined by the schedule in which the food is delivered. Whether that comes after a fixed or variable interval of time or a fixed or variable ratio in response to the number of presses of a bar. The most powerful control of behavior is with what's called a variable ratio schedule. That is, the animal gets the food pellet after a certain number of presses, but that number varies unpredictably from each time to time. Animals will work themselves to exhaustion to get food on a variable ratio schedule. That is exactly how slot machines pay off. Exactly. And we can all see the influence on behavior that they have. If you've never walked through a casino in Las Vegas, it's very enlightening to watch that kind of behavior. Well, that's how email pays off. Once in a while you get a food pellet. A love note, something about a business success, a funny video, a joke, but they come rarely and unpredictably in a variable ratio in response to how often you check email. And that's why it is so hard not to do it. And when that is, when there is an accompanying ping or of a text landing or you've got mail, that sound becomes very reinforcing as well. And there are even papers written about this becoming a true addiction. That, for instance, the sounds that slot machines make in Las Vegas cause dopamine release in the brain, and people become addicted to that stimulation. So I just want you to think about all this, that this is, this is an area where we have to be careful. I think that the tendency of this unprecedented amount of information coming at us, much of which, by the way, is of very low quality. This is something that someone has proposed the term data smog for what we are living in today. It makes it very difficult to sort out information that's important and that we really need. Anyway, this is an area I think that if you're concerned about mental emotional wellness, it's something you have to be careful about and set limits for how much this influences you. Now, I'm not so sure that the goal of human life is to be happy. And I think that in our culture, there is a particularly toxic expectation that people are supposed to be happy all the time, and our kids are supposed to be happy all the time. And that toxic cultural expectation is nowhere more apparent than when the holiday season approaches. And since we're about there, let me comment on that for a minute. In the northern hemisphere, the time of the winter solstice traditionally was seen as a time of great danger. You know, this is the time when the life force is at its lowest ebb, when the sun is at its lowest point in the sky, the days are shortest, the nights are darkest, the period of bad weather is yet to come. And one statement I saw, I don't know where this comes from, whether it's from the I Ching, but some ancient wisdom, that says it's the time of year, the winter solstice is the time of year when only the wisest can discern the returning of the light. Anyway, I think the natural tendency in the past was for people to gather together, to huddle together, build fires, eat together, tell stories, and to sort of aim for protection through this dangerous period. It was certainly not to be happy all the time. And I think the disconnect between what the culture tells us and being bombarded on all channels that this is the happiest time of the year, and yet when in fact what you're feeling, not only from the natural forces out there, but from the realities of family reunions and expectations of presents and all of that, I mean, it's a disaster. One of the things that I found in researching this book is that the origin of the word happy, I did not know this, it comes from an Old Norse root that means luck or fortune. It's related to the words perhaps and happenstance. And that suggests that people tend to pin their hopes for happiness on external things. And I think that's in fact what most people imagine. I don't think fortune is a very good place to pin your hopes for positive emotions because fortune is fickle, and if you sign up for the highs of fortune, you're going to get the lows. I think, in fact, that's the case in this culture, that many people imagine that happiness has to do with getting something that you now don't have. You know, a new car, a bigger house, a better job. Whenever I hear the phrase, the pursuit of happiness, which is written into our Constitution, the image that always comes to my mind is of a greyhound chasing a mechanical rabbit around a track that's always just out of reach. I think a much better goal to strive for in the emotional realm is contentment. Contentment is a sense of completeness, wholeness, that's independent of external circumstances of what you have. And I think in addition to working towards being more contented or experience that more of the time, it's also useful to work at experiencing greater comfort and serenity and resilience, which allows you to ride the ups and downs of life. And we're supposed to have emotional lows as well as highs. Just as there are sunny days and cloudy days, moods are supposed to vary. They're not supposed to vary in extremes, to extremes that incapacitate us, but I think it is normal to cycle. One of the senses that I had in the period of my life when I was experiencing depression was that some of this was existential, that this was part of who I was, and that I had to accept this. And I also had a suspicion, which I found very difficult to talk to anyone about. I mean, I tried various forms of psychotherapy that really never did much for me. But one of the ideas that I had that I found very difficult to talk with mental health professionals about was a sense that somehow my depressions were connected to my creativity. And that not necessarily why I was in them, but when I came out of them, I often came out with inspiration and the burst of energy to write, for example. There is another concept that I discovered in writing this book that I want to share with you that I think is very interesting. There's a field called evolutionary psychology, quite new, which attempts to explain our mental processes in evolutionary terms. And very recently, a few evolutionary psychologists have suggested that natural selection has picked a trait toward depression as something that has survival value. And this may be one reason why we're so prone to it. And their reasoning goes like this. The essence of depression is a strong inward focus and a tendency to ruminate, to chew over and over on the same thought or thoughts, which are often the source of emotional distress. The term depressive rumination in psychology is always used in a pathological sense. This is seen as a bad thing. But these evolutionary psychologists suggest that depressive rumination and inward focus favor problem solving. And that if you're confronted with a very difficult problem, that doing this, engaging in depressive rumination until you decide either that the problem is insolvable and you give it up, or you come up with a solution and move on. And this may be one reason why we see such an obvious correlation between depression and creativity. I mean, I could spend the whole evening giving you lists of names of famous artists, composers, writers, musicians who have suffered from depression, many of whom have turned to alcohol or drug use, some of whom have committed suicide, but this correlation is very striking. So I think that the idea that depression is always a bad thing and it's something we want to make go away, that may not be a useful concept. You know, you don't want it to be so severe as to incapacitate you, but I think accepting the lows of life as well as the highs and having the resilience to ride through them is a very good thing, and I think that quality of resilience can be cultivated. I have to tell you that I'm not a big fan of antidepressant medications. I think they may have their place, but the theory on which they're based looks very shaky to me. And there is a growing body of medical evidence that the most popular class of antidepressants, the SSRIs, work no better than placebos. I'm sure you've seen some of this in the papers, but this is really a very solid case being built. And the people who were proponents of these drugs, when this started to come out, retreated to the position, well, that may be true in mild to moderate depression, but there's a clear usefulness in severe depression. Now, even in severe depression, it's impossible to demonstrate a difference between placebos, and it's only in very, very severe depression, which is a fairly small minority of cases, that there might be an advantage to using antidepressant drugs. The theory that depression, this is the biomedical model, which I think is extremely limited, which sees all of our thought processes and emotions as being the results of brain biochemistry. And therefore, you address the biochemistry and you can forget about everything else. To me, it seems that our emotional states are very multifactorial, and there's so many things that influence them, and there's so many options for treatment. The biomedical model is sorely limited, and its view is that depression results from a deficiency of serotonin at brain neural junctions. There is a drug currently being marketed in the UK under the brand name Coaxil that's been shown to be an effective antidepressant that lowers brain serotonin levels. You can't have it both ways. I think this theory is flawed and incomplete, and it's looking less and less convincing as more of this evidence comes out about the fact that these drugs don't work better than placebos. There's an alternative hypothesis of depression that I came across while doing research of this book that looks at a nutritional connection that I find quite fascinating. And I'd like to tell you about it. It's an interesting story, and it's consistent with the dietary advice that I've been giving for a number of years. You may know that for a long time I've recommended an anti-inflammatory diet as the best strategy for achieving optimum longevity and reducing risks of disease. Inflammation is the cornerstone of the body's healing response. We all know it on the surface of the body as local heat, redness, swelling, and pain at an area that's injured or under attack. It's how the body gets more nourishment and more immune activity to an area that needs it. But inflammation is so powerful and it's so potentially destructive that it's very important that it stay where it's supposed to stay and end when it's supposed to end. If inflammation serves no purpose, if it persists, it becomes productive of disease. It damages tissues. Because of this potential, the body regulates inflammation very carefully. It has an elaborate system of hormonal and chemical controls on inflammation. It's very important that you be able to produce enough inflammation. If you can't, you're susceptible to infection. But it's also important that you not produce too much inflammation. Then you get allergies and autoimmune diseases. But now it looks as if this is the root cause of all the really big, bad chronic diseases that become much more common as people get older. Cardiovascular disease, neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, and cancer all begin as inflammatory processes. For instance, the link with cancer may be a little less obvious, but anything that stimulates inflammation also stimulates cells to divide more frequently. And whenever cells divide more frequently, the risk of malignant transformation is increased. So it seems to me that the best advice that you can give people about overall health is to lead an anti-inflammatory lifestyle. A lot of things influence inflammation: genetics, stress, exposure to environmental toxins like secondhand smoke, but diet has a huge influence. And in a nutshell, the mainstream American diet, or the modern diet, is strongly pro-inflammatory. It's pro-inflammatory because of what it gives you, which are the wrong kinds of fats, the wrong kinds of carbohydrates, and because what doesn't give you, which is all the protective elements mostly found in fruits and vegetables and herbs and spices and teas and so forth that protect the body against inflammatory damage. If I could summarize everything I know about nutrition and health in one sentence, it would be to stop eating refined, processed, and manufactured food. That simple. But now there appears to be an interesting link with emotional health, which I was unaware of. And the way this story developed, I find fascinating. Farmers have long known that when domestic animals get sick, usually with infectious illnesses, they exhibit a characteristic pattern of behavioral changes that are called sickness behavior. And these include immobility, loss of appetite, loss of interest in socializing with others of their kind, loss of interest in sex, changes that are strikingly similar to changes in human beings who have major depression. Farmers have traditionally attributed sickness behavior to fatigue associated with illness. But in the 1950s, it was found that this was mediated by a blood-borne factor. You can take blood from an animal showing sickness behavior, inject it into a healthy animal, and that animal shows sickness behavior. Nobody knew what was responsible. It was called factor X for a long time. In the 1970s, factor X was identified as a group of regulatory proteins used by the immune system to control inflammation. These are called cytokines. They include things like interferon and the interleukins and tumor necrosis factor. Shortly afterwards, some of these became available in purified form as medical treatments. For example, interferon became available as a treatment for chronic hepatitis. One of the most severe and dangerous side effects of interferon therapy is severe depression and suicide. And if you look in the package inserts of interferon, this is very prominent in bold print, as a serious side effect. So this has led to the cytokine hypothesis of depression, which to me makes a lot more sense than the serotonin hypothesis of depression. And it links depression and upregulated inflammation in the body. These are correlated. And it may be now that that depression that we're seeing in our culture, that one factor producing this is another manifestation of a pro-inflammatory state that people in our culture are mostly in, strongly as a result of the diet that they eat. In addition to the physical interventions that you can do to protect yourself from depression, to enhance emotional wellness, there's a whole range of mental things that can be done that both include new forms of Western psychotherapy, such as cognitive behavioral therapy, which I find to be much more time and cost efficient than traditional forms of psychotherapy. This is one way of learning to manage thoughts. Thoughts really are the main source of both anxiety and despair, and it is not an easy process to learn to manage or change thoughts, but we have these new forms of psychotherapy that are highly effective. From Eastern psychology, there's a whole range of techniques, many of them centered on forms of increasing attention, focusing attention. I think in my own case, practicing meditation, which I've now done over a very long period of time, has been one of the strategies that has most, in me, cultivated emotional resilience and serenity and been responsible for the fading of the depressions that I used to experience. I also included in the book a lot of discussion of what I call spiritual interventions under the heading of secular spirituality. And this is a term I've been trying to popularize. I am a very much believer in, and I place great importance on, the non-physical dimension of our lives. And I think this is a very significant influence on our physical health and our mental health. And I've always tried to give people advice about how to manage that non-physical area. But I like to do that without reference to a deity or to the supernatural, or to sacred books, or to ideas that are in conflict with what we know to be scientific truth. And so I find it easier to put this all under the heading of secular spirituality. If people are religious and want to attend to their spiritual life in that way, that's fine with me. But for people who are not, I think it is equally important to look at these other things that you can do. Under that heading, there are a lot of things that I could discuss, and I'll be happy to answer some questions about this. There is a very interesting body of information showing that emotions are contagious, that we exert some kind of influence on each other in the non-physical realm, and we can chart the progress of emotional states through groups exactly the way that we can chart the progress of infectious diseases. So not only is depression contagious, but happiness is contagious. And this has been statistically charted. If you have a happy friend who lives within a half mile of you, your chance of being happy is increased by 20%. And that effect falls off with distance. And beyond a certain distance, it's a negligible effect. This is very interesting, and that means you should pay a lot of attention to the people that you associate with and try to have happier people in your circle. There's another interesting idea that I came across that I like. There's a hypothesis. This was first proposed by Charles Darwin, interestingly enough. He called this the facial feedback hypothesis of emotion, which states that it's generally assumed that if you have an emotional state, your facial expression reflects that. So the arrows of cause and effect are going from the mind to facial musculature. Darwin suggested that facial muscular had a feedback effect on the brain, so that imitating or simulating an emotional state with your face actually eventually produces the emotion. Now, of course, this is something known to every good actor. This is what actors do in order to emote. And this gives some real scientific credence to such trite phrases as smile and the whole world smiles with you. But it is in fact true that you can, by smiling, by laughing, you can produce the corresponding emotional states. So it works in both directions. I think one of the surprises that I came across in looking at this area was the tremendous amount of scientific data that we now have for the power of gratitude to boost emotional states. There are two aspects to gratitude. One is feeling grateful, and the other is expressing it. And both of these are necessary. And gratitude is feeling thankful for something that you've received. It's not about something inside you. It's about feeling grateful for something that you experience as a gift, whether that's your health, the sun, the food on the table, and so forth. We also have a great deal of scientific evidence about the power of forgiveness to improve emotional states, but forgiveness is not so easy. That's got a lot of tough stuff associated with it. The challenge, I think, in myself when I look at this, I think that the two main challenges to forgiving, the first, the biggest one, is not wanting to exonerate the person that you see as having harmed you or caused you injury, not wanting to make that person innocent. And this is a subject of much theological and philosophical writing. And the general conclusion, which I think is very important, is that forgiveness is something you do for yourself, not for the other person. And the other person need not even know about it. It is giving up a burden of toxic emotions that you are carrying with you. But anyway, I think this is a charged subject. On the other hand, gratitude, there's nothing in the way of doing that. It's totally easy. All you have to do is remember to do it. There's an exercise that comes from the field of positive psychology, a relatively new branch of psychology, which I think is terrific. Some of you may be aware of it. It's called keeping a gratitude journal. You get a little notebook that you dedicate to this and keep it by your bedside. And during the day, you make mental notes of things that you have to be grateful for. It doesn't have to be many, 1, 2, 3, whatever. And when you get into bed, you jot them down. Doing that exercise for 1 week can produce lasting emotional uplift for 6 months. That's pretty amazing. So why aren't we all doing this? I think, this a good one to remember and a good one to practice. I'm going to stop in a moment. I want to continue by answering some of the questions that you've written. I think it's it's an urgent priority to try to create a new paradigm of mental and emotional health. In March of 2010, our Center for Integrative Medicine at the University of Arizona sponsored the first national conference on integrative mental health. It was held in Phoenix. We planned to have about 300 mental health professionals there, psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers, counselors. We ended up having 700. If we'd had a bigger venue, we could have had twice that number. The hunger in this group for a new way of doing things was palpable. Enormous numbers of mental health professionals are fed up with simply recommending drugs to people. Just as many patients are fed up with this. And the biomedical model, I think it's disastrously limiting in physical medicine as well. But in the field of mental and emotional health, it's stifling at the moment. And it's time, this does not mean, I don't mean to deny the reality or importance of brain biochemistry, but it's one of many factors that influence how we feel and our moods. And it is time to develop a much broader paradigm of mental and emotional health, and to begin to use all these other options that are out there, and to get away from this incredible use of medication, a great deal of which doesn't do us any good and may do us a lot of harm, which a staggering number of people are now using. So I'm going to stop there, and I'd like to continue by answering some of the questions that you wrote.